Right, good evening everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about, accent plants. Basically, these are things that we tend to use in display and for display purposes. You can use them in club displays, you can use them in personal displays, and you'll find more and more now that some of the events around Europe and certainly some in the UK are also asking not for you just to put a tree forward, but for you to put a considered display forward. And that means probably the use of an accent plant or accessories. You need to put your bonsai tree on a table and you need to find an accent or an accessory to go with it for the sort of display that these shows are asking for. So I'm going to talk, there's two words you've probably heard to do with accent plants. One is called kusumono and the other is shitakusa or shaksa, it should be pronounced. Now, kusumono is a planting that really should be displayed on its own. It means a solitary planting or a solitary grass. It's something that you plant on its own, or you display on its own. Whereas we come to the other one, which is the shitakusa or the shaksa, as it's pronounced in Japan. And that is considered an undergrass or a complementary grass. So this is the ones I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about the plantings that we use to complement our bonsais in a display point of view. So what we're looking for when we have this initial idea of using an accent plant is we need to try and find a plant or some sort of little exhibit, accessory planting that will give a feeling of maybe season to our display, or maybe add a splash of colour, or also maybe give some sort of hint as to the habitat or where the tree was collected from originally. So we don't want to be showing sort of plants that we expect. Really, your imagination can run riot. It's absolutely up to you. There's so much stuff there that you can bring together and put together for your own purposes to try and get this little accent plant to complement your display. So plants we can use, well, throughout the year. We can use bulbs, we can use winter flowering bulbs, we can use spring flowering bulbs, we can use grasses, we can use summer flowering, some of the larger leaved hostas and stuff like that. They'd be very difficult to get them down to a reasonable size for use in a bonsai display. But there's a lot of dwarf hostas as well that are absolutely ideal for our sort of purposes. What soil do they require? Well, pretty much the same as your bonsai stuff. If you grow deciduous bonsai trees, you'll find a lot of these plants will quite happily grow in akadama or a mix of akadama and bark. If you're growing like hostas, they like an acidic soil, so we can put them into kanuma, which is the same stuff we use for our azaleas. It's the same thing as growing your trees. Because you're growing them in such small pots, what you're trying to achieve is the optimum conditions to get the maximum amount of root within that pot. So using these free draining soils, the same as you do in bonsai. Any of you that listened in to me talk on tree physiology, I gave an insight into how roots grow, and roots are very similar on a lot of these little plants that we use for accents. So getting this free draining soil, getting these conditions right for maximum root growth in a smaller pot will help you along greatly. It really will. You can tend to pop them on a little bit more often than bonsai. Most of these plants we use for accent plants, they will readily and quite vigorously fill a pot with roots. So maybe every 2 or 3 years or every 3 or 4 years, you can think about popping these on again. Maybe removing some of the plants and putting a smaller portion back into the same pot. And that again will then self-propagate. A lot of the plants I'll talk about and I'll show you later on when we show some pictures will actually self-propagate within a pot. So when it comes down to you for getting yourself more stock or maintaining a continuation of your stock, then you can do this within a pot situation with a lot of accent plants and a lot of alpine plants. So where do we get our plants from? Well, we can collect them. You can go out into meadows, you can go on paths, garden walls, you can go into forests, and you'll find these little self-seeded plants. Obviously, collecting them only within an area where you've got permission, or it's not like a national trust or site of scientific interest. But if you're collecting a couple of little ferns out of your garden wall, or getting stuff out of your garden, I don't think that's a great issue myself. One of the best places I've found is to go to these alpine plant shows, or if you go into a lot of garden centres, they'll have a section completely devoted to alpine plants. So you can have a look through that. And a good thing to do if you're going to do that sort of thing is get an idea ahead of when you might be wanting to show your trees. And then roughly the same time that you want to show your trees, maybe the year before, go into the garden centres, have a look around and see what looks suitable at that time of year, because it will also be suitable at the same time next year for your own ends. So if you decide you want a little flowering plant or something with a different coloured foliage or something, then have a look around at the same time of year that you expect to be displaying your trees, and find out what plants are providing the colour or the foliage or the flower contrast that you want. Joining an Alpine Garden Society, that's another fantastic way of finding plants, if you can be bothered go to those lengths. But you find, like, we're bonsai enthusiasts and we have masses of trees, or some of us do, and we have stuff for sale and stuff to swap and move on. Then within Alpine Garden Societies, then the members have the same thing. They have masses of plants that they self-propagate, and they take cuttings and they take growth from seed and stuff, and they bring them to meetings and they sell them off really fairly cheap. So that's a good way of finding material to make your accent plants with. Another way is on the internet. You can go onto Alpine plant nurseries, you can Google and you can find them locally to yourselves or within the UK, wherever you want. You can look at their stocks online, see what they've got, and you can get plants sent to you. So that's reasonably successful as well for getting an initial stock if that's what you want. So propagating your own stock, again, with a lot of the same as a lot of other plants, we can grow from seed, we can go from cuttings. There's a lot of plants like hostas and other sort of small perennial plants, maybe sort of deciduous type perennial plants, where we can actually split the rhizome or split the plant into 2 or 3 smaller pieces in winter and just pop them on into smaller pots, so long as each part of types of plant pot, and put some bulbs in there. And generally with that little bit of extra room, they'll self-propagate. So that comes down to the likes of snowdrops and crocus, and maybe a plant called rhodohypoxis, which I'll show you quite a bit of later on, which is a lovely little plant to use for accent plants. So yeah, a lot of these things will self-propagate within the pot. So watering, yeah, pretty much the same. You've got them in a free draining soil, so water them a lot through the summer. You can't overwater them. It's more in winter when these plants are in small pots, and some of them, especially the likes of hostas and rhodohypoxis and some other sort of summer flowering bulbs, they have very tender roots. So the ideal thing you can do in winter is maybe put them under some sort of cover. Once the soil is dry, or the substrate is reasonably dry, then ice hasn't got the expansion and crushing process that it has if you've got a lot of water in the pot. So keeping your accent plants a little bit drier over the winter will certainly help them get through the winter and come into the next year without any harm whatsoever. So maybe using one of these little plastic greenhouses, but I mean, you don't have to keep the door shut. You can leave the door open. It's more about having a cover over these things. If they're dry, most of the plants, if we're using hardy plants in this country, they'll take temperatures down to -5, -6. So we're not really having to do anything really special for them. Just keep a little more of an eye on the dampness in the winter. In very hot weather, when we get like really a little bit of summer, or we do occasionally get in the summer, then maybe standing your plants on little gravel trays. So if you use the shallow trays, maybe they're about 1/2 inch, maybe up to 3/4 of an inch deep that you put underneath plant troughs or underneath plant pots. Just put a layer of gravel in, fill it with water, and stand your pots on it. They don't need to be standing in the water, but the humidity around the plants all day will certainly help with stopping them drying out. If you're out at work all day and you're worried about watering them, I mean, putting shade netting over them again, the same as you might do with deciduous bonsai trees, or even putting them more into the shade and just giving them a couple of hours of, sunlight early morning or last thing of an evening is fine as well. But one of the issues with this is not that the plants don't like the temperature. It's that when we put small pots into sun, it acts almost like a kiln effect. That the ceramics or the porcelains of the pots will absorb the heat of the sun. And I did some measurements, well, some sort of experiments a couple of years back, and I checked the outside temperature just outside some of my bonsai pots, and it was 26 degrees. And I put a thermometer on the inside wall of my bonsai pot in a sunny day when it was 26 degrees, and the inside wall of my bonsai pot was 41 degrees. And that was purely through absorption of heat into the ceramic and the porcelain. Now, if you look at the way, and I'm going a little bit offline on accent plants, but if we look at the likes of Italy and Spain now, a lot of those places are starting to put tinfoil and stuff around their bonsai pots. They're actually starting to insulate them against the heat in summer. Because once your temperatures go above maybe 24, 26, 27 degrees, then your physiological processes within plants, or within most plants, and certainly the ones we're going to use, are going to start shutting down. So the plant won't actually grow when the temperatures are up in that sort of level. So there's no point letting the plant get there if you can avoid it. You're going to cause more evaporation and damage to your plants. So this is one of the things maybe for accent plants, because they've got such a small volume of soil, less so than bonsai plants. Once that outer pot heats up, then that soil will heat up and dry out fairly quickly. So a little bit of shade netting, or just being a bit more aware, keep them onto this gravel bed with a bit of water around it, will help them out no end. Winter protection, again, I've said pretty much most of them, just keep them on the dry side. Putting them against a house wall, or putting them in a greenhouse, or certainly the deciduous types of plants, the ones that lose their leaves over winter, deciduous types of perennials, they could go into a dark shed or a garage, anything really to keep the damp off them and keep that real hard degree of frost off them. So fertilizing, well, with some of these plants being in such small pots, putting solid fertilizer on can be quite difficult. It tends to wash off, or you can only put a tiny bit on. So I tend to use the likes of seaweed, liquid fertilizers, maybe a bit of fish emulsion and stuff like that. Yeah, definitely mostly liquid fertilizers. And you don't want to fertilize your accents too much. You want to keep them. You want to keep them just sort of growing in control. When we get bonsai trees that are more mature and we've started to get smaller leaves and more refined images, you can do exactly the same with accent plants. Once you start to get these plants a little bit pot bound, then the leaf size on them, quite a lot of them will reduce accordingly. And they also tend to flower better when they get pot bound. So you can do the same thing as we do with bonsai trees. You can actually get the leaves and the foliage size to reduce. So what's the plant arrangement requirements? Well, basically what I'm going to talk about now is what do we need to do to put an accent plant together? What considerations do we need to think about? If we're thinking, well, we've got this nice tree that we're working on for a couple of years and we've got it ready for our show, and now we want to put an accent plant with it. So basically, there's no basic about it. There's quite a few things we should be looking out for. And that's that the accent plant and the pot you put it in, the whole sort of thing together should harmonize with the tree. So the pot color and the texture that you're using for your accent plant should not replicate the pot colour and the texture that you're using for your tree. The whole thing about display is absolutely about asymmetry. You really should have no repetition throughout your display. So if you've got a tree in a brown pot, you don't want to use a brown pot for your accent plant. You want to use a different colour, and you want to use a colour that will complement the brown of the main tree. When you pick a colour for your pot, you also need to decide a plant colour that's going to go into it that will harmonise with the pot. So straight away we've got 3 variables. So we need 2 different colours for our pots from our tree and our accent plants, and we need different colours between our accent plants, our pots and our tree. We want to keep this variation all the time. We need to remember this not just in the colour of the pot, but in the shape of the pot as well. So if our tree, I'm sorry if this sounds really complicated, but I'm trying to explain this thing about not having any replication anywhere. So if our tree is in a rectangular pot, we want to look at a different shaped pot for our accent plant. So it could be circular, it could be oval, it could be an informal sort of rustic type shape. We might decide to use a piece of wood or a bit of stone instead. If the pot our tree's in is in an oval pot, then obviously we want to avoid using an oval pot for our accent plants. So we can go for more of a round pot or a rectangular pot, or again, a freeform pot. So it's avoiding replication all the time. And we need to think about this as well when we come down to like flower colours. So if we choose an accent plant, an accent pot that is a red, we don't really want to be having a plant in it that has a red flower on it or that has red foliage. We want this contrast all the time. So there's a differential between the pot, the accent plant you've put in it, and the actual tree and the pot itself. We want this change all the time, these different aspects of colour. And even down to foliage texture. In the second half of this talk, we're going to look at a couple of pictures of accent plants. Most of them are mine, some are others from members of Wirral Bonsai Society, but I'll show you some examples where the actual foliage of the plant, the leaf shape and leaf texture might look very similar to a maple. And I've got other ones like when you start using ferns, some types of foliage shape and texture, and the feel and look about ferns is quite similar to sort of junipers and hinoki cypress. So you want to try and avoid this repetition or replication. So try not to use accent plants whose foliage, let alone colour, but whose foliage looks similar to the foliage of the tree you're displaying. We want this complete sort of contrast all the time. The difficulty with this is you've got to find a contrast that actually complements and harmonises. For colours, years ago I wasn't wonderful. One of the best things I found was a colour wheel. Artists use it a lot, and if you Google it or look in some decent books, you'll see a thing called a colour wheel, and it'll have your 3 primary colours and your 3 main secondary colours placed around a 360-degree wheel. And basically the way they've set them out is the colours opposite each other will complement each other, and colours next to each other on the wheel clash with each other. So you get an idea what red goes with and what yellow goes with and what blue goes with and green, and it gives you ideas for matching colours that way. So you don't have to be sort of artistically gifted as from an interior design point of view where you can mix and match colours and get the perfect result. There are things out there that will help you, give you a sort of aesthetic guideline, so you're not putting silly things together, and you're also giving yourself a chance of putting things together that will go well and will complement your display. And that's what all this is about. So we've also found that a lot of pots, certainly accent pots, if they're not an absolutely formal pot, they will have a front. But when you actually pick that pot up and look at it, like the glaze will be better on one side, or it'll have a bit of a direction to one side. Certainly with free-form pots and the more rustic pots that we use, and if we want to start using bits of stone or bits of wood to plant our accent plants on, then a lot of these items, the pots and the stuff, they will have direction and they have a sort of flow to them. So when you're considering putting your planting together, pick the pot up or the stone or whatever you're using, whatever you're using for your accent plant to go in your display, and actually have a look which way it inclines or which way it flows. This might become a little bit clearer when we go through some pictures of it, well, in the second half, I suppose. So the other thing we need to consider, we talked about earlier on at the start, is seasons and trying to show a seasonal interest in your plants. So if we're showing in winter time, we can use dried grasses, we can use winter flowers, the sorts of primulas, snowdrops, there's some iris, there's a lot of saxifrages. There's a lot of sort of winter bulbs that we can use and winter flowering plants if we want to put colour in our display. We can also use sort of dried grasses or dried seed heads, because that's what we see in nature in winter. Before these grasses start growing again in spring, we see the remnants of last year, and that is these dried blades of grass and the dried seed heads on them. So that's quite acceptable to use. Spring, we can move on to anything with new emergent buds, anything with like new bright green foliage, stuff that might just be coming out of the soil, little ferns unfolding. They have a particularly spring-like look to them as the season's starting to go on. There's other, again, flowering plants, flowering bulbs and corms that come out in spring, so we can use these. We need to think about if we're showing spring flowering trees or maybe the likes of crab apples, we don't want to use a flowering accent plant with the likes of that, because again, we're creating that replication. If we've got flowers in our tree, we don't really want flowers in our accent plants. We need to think of something different. So maybe some emergent foliage or something a bit different for trees like crab apples, or maybe even like the likes of your blackthorn and hawthorn. If you're lucky enough to have a show on at the time when they're in flower and you can show them, then please don't be showing them with a flowering accent plant. We want this contrast all the time, but they also one thing to complement another. And using a flowering accent plant with a flowering tree is just a little bit too much. One shout at the other somehow. But we can discuss that a little bit further going on. So in summer, we can use, again, we can have flowering summer plants, the likes of the rhodohypoxis I spoke about before. They're a very small South African bulb. They flower anything between about 3 centimetres up to about 7 centimetres above a pot. So they're really quite small, but they have spectacular little flowers on them. They're quite long-lived flowering-wise. They'll flower from May through to about September. So that covers maybe a number of opportunities for you to have a plant like that as an accent and actually be able to use it in a show sometime. So we've got the likes of the silbies and ferns, and there's all sorts of alpine pants and little hostas, the dwarf hostas and stuff. They have different colours of foliage, different foliage shapes. A lot of them flower with different coloured flowers. So all these sort of things can be used for summer. And then we can move on to autumn. And again, we can go for autumn colours. So a lot of the perennial plants that are actually deciduous, once they've grown, they put shoots out in the spring, and they grow through the summer with a nice green foliage or whatever foliage. Quite often, for a certain couple of weeks of the year, they will go into like an autumn colour foliage, the same as our trees do. So for autumn times, you can use accent plants that are actually showing autumn colour foliage. Again, we can use berries. There's a lot of, we tend to know potentilla as trees, but there's, or shrubby trees. There's also sort of deciduous Oh, sorry, I'm missing a word here, but they grow as actual plants as well, like soft, tender plants, perennial plants, but not as a tree. So they don't sort of develop a hard bark or a lignified trunk, but they will grow as a soft stem perennial year after year, and they will produce flowers and berries. So the likes of that and other plants. Again, a garden centre is a good place to go. So if you go around garden centres September, October, you'll see what little plants and what little shrubs they've got for sale in the alpine sections, and you'll see what plants are holding berries. So they might have like a little bit of red colour or a bit of purple, and that might be something you want to think of incorporating in your display when you come to put it together. So you've got all these options of using different seasonal elements. And again, as we said earlier, grasses that are coming to the end of summer, they end up with seed heads on them, which tend to become quite prominent in autumn time. So that's another good plant because it shows a season and they can be quite delicate. Another thing we need to try and keep in mind, or it's very nice if we can, that if we can try and get our accent plants, I did speak about this earlier on when I started, but to try and get our accent plant to have some sort of correlation to where the tree came from or the style of the tree. So we don't want to have a really twisted and tortuous looking conifer like a pine or a juniper with loads of deadwood on it and show it with a pretty little flowering plant that would obviously come from a lowland region. So we need to bear in mind what sort of image our tree has given us, whether it's a high altitude tree or a middle altitude tree or maybe a lowland meadow type tree. And if we can, try and use plants from a similar sort of region so it keeps the same sort of theme together of the origin or the habitat of where that tree came from or where that tree lived, and get your accent plant to marry in with this a little bit. So if we go on to meadow and plain trees, we can use grasses, flowers, sort of soft edged plants with maybe hostas with maybe slightly larger leaves. We can use marsh plants for trees that look like they might be overhanging a pond or growing near water, the likes of willows and stuff. So you can use little reeds and little grasses and stuff for those sort of things to try and give an impression of water. Once we go into the sort of mountainous plants and we look at like really tortured junipers and pines that are twisted and loads of deadwood, we want to be looking at little thymes and maybe tiny little grasses, maybe little herbs and stuff that we're going to find, shrubby little plants that we're going to find up on the higher mountainsides. Yeah, it's just having a little think about where you think that your tree should originate from or what feeling the tree gives, and then using an appropriate plant. It's a nice way. I mean, we all aim to show in British and UK shows, so it's nice to use sort of British and UK collected or native accent plants. And once you start going into them, there's literally hundreds and hundreds out there. But it's finding the ones that are suitable for you and finding the availability. But there's absolutely loads and loads of native plants that we can use. And I think that's got its own certain feel to it as well. If you want to show an English elm or maybe an oak or a tree that is predominantly native to Britain and the UK, then it's quite appropriate and quite nice to actually use a plant for your accent plant that is native and predominantly native to the UK as well. So, right, pot selection. Well, we've got a choice of anything you want. We can go for formal pots. We can have freeform, rustic pots. Hopefully when I show some, Ming hopefully will kindly show some pictures for me later on. We can have a little look at different pots for any of you that are not familiar with accent pots, but we can use stones to plant our plants on, or we can use bits of driftwood. There's certain ways of tying these things on. So if you want to use a piece of driftwood or a stone, We can tie them on with little bits of subtle wire, or we can use stuff called keto, which is a Japanese moss peat. It's like a sticky sort of peat mix that you can make little walls out, almost like a plasticine. It's like an organic plasticine. So you can build little walls, and you can stick plants onto bits of rock with it. And once the roots get down into it, they'll hold quite happily, and the plant won't move around on the rock or the wood. They'll adhere themselves with using the bits of keto and stuff. We also find that where we place the plants in the pot itself will help with direction. So when we've got a tree in display, most of our trees have an actual direction. When we look at what we've decided to be the chosen front of our tree, most of our trees will either go to the left or to the right. So if your tree grows predominantly to the right, the actual flow of the tree is to the right, then we need to place an accent plant on the right-hand side of that display. And we need that accent plant to have a growth to the left. Is that clear to everyone? If the tree moves to the right, we need the plant on the opposite side moving to the left. If the tree moves to the left, then we put our accent plant to the left of that, and the accent plant should move to the right. Now, by planting your actual accent plant to one extreme or slightly off center to one end of the pot slightly, will actually help give that plant a direction and a flow, even if the pot has no flows. So if we have an oval pot or a rectangle pot, and we move our plant to the left of the pot and have an open space on the right, that plant will actually look like it's moving towards the right. And we can do the same thing with our bonsai trees. We can move them to one side of center. They should never really be planted in the center of the pot, but slightly off center and away from the direction of the tree. So you're leaving a bit of open space. Always visually, although we might not appreciate it, but when we look at it with our eyes, it visually gives that plant a flow to that direction. So you can help yourself by creating direction in your accent plants by actually where you position the plant in the pot. So if you think about what tree you want to show it with, then give consideration to where you're going to plant your accent plant in your accent pot, and try and leave the open space on the side towards your tree. Now, as I said earlier on, an accent plant, it's like a full stop to a display. If we look at a display, we look at the base of a tree and our eyes move up a tree, and we look at the foliage and we realize that tree has got some sort of direction, and then our eyes follow the direction and that tree's sending us in. Well, if we've got a little accent plant coming back in the opposite direction, it encloses the display for us. It sort of makes a frame, so our eyes don't look over here to the right and to the left. Our eyes focus on the tree and the plants as a whole, being sort of framed together as one individual display. So we can use tables underneath our accent plants. We can alter the height of them. We can use tables. We can use little burrs and jitters. We can use mats. What we don't want to do is we don't want our accent plants really to come higher than the table, the level of the table that your bonsai is planted on or sat on, displayed on. They should always be an underplanting. They should be lower. The only time, maybe if you've got one in autumn, you might have a seed head of grass, or if you've got a very, very tall sort of accent plant, as a flowering accent plant, then maybe one flower just to come over the edge of the table, at the height of the table that your tree is displayed on, or reach the rim of the pot, is acceptable, but really you don't want to be going higher than that. Your accent plant really shouldn't come up any higher, or should really be lower than the level of the table that the tabletop that your bonsai is standing on. So that gives you an idea, and proportionally, I would say this is a very difficult one to sort of describe in words, because it's more about aesthetics and a feel of what looks right. If we use accent plants with a lot of flowers on, or a lot of berries and stuff like that, they will actually look bigger in volume than what they are. But I would say an accent plant should be at least only 10% of the sort of volume of your main display, and probably a lot less than that, in all honesty. Because once you start using colours in your pots and colours in your foliage, or colours in your actual flowers of your accent plants, then to our eyes, it looks like it's got more volume. It looks like it's bigger because it's more of an impact to our eyes because of the colour that it brings. So bear in mind your accent plants are not too big and not out of proportion, but it's really difficult to explain exactly what the proportion on that should be. The best way is to go around some shows and look at trees and look at accent plants that people have put on display, and actually decide if you think that aesthetically the size is right, or the accent plant overpowers the tree. But these are complementary plantings. We never ever want people's eyes to be drawn straight to the accent plant. It should be the minor part of our display, and the absolute minor. It should almost be an insignificant part of our display, but just enough to finish our display off and complement our display. So again, we've talked a little about flow lines. You can actually remove parts of foliage. You can create shape in your actual accent plant itself to try and create more flow. So if we leave higher stalks or higher stems on the outside of our accent plants, and maybe have lower stems on the inside towards the middle of our display, it gives the actual plant a flow and a line and a movement back into the center of our display. So it keeps taking our eye back to the tree, and the flow of the tree keeps taking our eye back to the accent plant. So the two flow together and complement each other really well. You can use sunlight. There's an example that we'll show in the pictures later on, or in the second half, which won't be far away. You can actually leave a plant facing the same direction, and the individual stems, the leaves, and to an extent the flowers will all turn towards the light. This gives the tree, the accent plant, a sort of linear composition where everything is aligned and all facing, or all just slightly leaning the same way, which obviously gives it a direction. So then you need to decide to use it on the correct side of your display, so the direction goes opposing to the direction of your tree, but complement each other. In Japan, they have a symbolism for different colours for plants and pots. I mean, colour-wise, like red means passion, white means purity, black is fear and stuff like that. I don't think, and the same in plants, they have certain plants like lilies tend to stand for purity and innocence, and they have like orchids stand for beauty and stuff like that. But in all honesty, I think, I don't wish to malign anyone, but with displays within the UK, maybe a little bit within Europe, if I started using different plants and different colours to signify different emotions and different morals and stuff like that, then I don't think many people would get it, to be honest with you. Peter Warren might, but I think he'd probably be about the only one. Without any disrespect to other people, maybe Rita Cooper and Mark Cooper would. They know the finer arts of Japanese culture and the actual way the Japanese people think. Yeah, that's a brief interlude into accent plants. So, okay, so this plant is called a grape hyacinth. It's muscari. It's a little bulb that flowers in early spring. It can be in flower from about February through to about April, something like that. You can get them in white. This is not a particularly good picture, but this flower is actually sort of bluish purple. It's quite a stunning plant. So for the likes of Swindon Show and places like that, it's an ideal plant. Again, it will sell. They're readily available they grow only probably, this plant itself is probably about 6 or 7 centimetres high from the top of the pot to the top of the bulb, top of the flower. It's really quite petite. And yeah, you can see that it's in a more of a formal, informal pot. A lot of the accent plots we find from potters when you go to bonsai shows and stuff like that, a lot of these potters have little pots for sale. They're various prices ranging from sort of £2–3 up to maybe £10–15, a little bit more now and again. But some of the pots in themselves are absolutely fascinating, and they're works of art, and they're beautiful little things to have in your collection. This is a little fern called, well, it's not a fern, it's very fern-like in its foliage. It's called Selaginella. Again, you can see that this is a very small plant, including the pot. It's probably only about 6 centimetres high. Now, I have a lot of showing trees and shoeing size trees, kifu size trees. So a lot of my trees are under sort of 18 inches or 450 mil. So I tend to have a lot of sort of smaller plants. The pot it's in is actually I think it's a Hattori pot. He's quite a famous Japanese potter. And this pot itself is probably about 40–50 years old. When you actually see this pot, it's got a patina and a sort of luster and glow to it. That's you can see the age in the pot. And this is something, if we're showing a tree that maybe some of the old hawthorns and stuff that we've got in this country or that we have in our collections, if you're showing a tree that's got age, we want to try and show some age in our accent plants as well. So whether it's by using a sort of aged pot or something that's not absolutely, doesn't look brand new. So this is a particularly nice little plant. It gets a really nice green colour foliage in the summer, and it gets a good bronze, and it goes through colours of reds and golds in spring and autumn. So it's a very versatile plant, and it's an evergreen plant as well. So any time of the year that you want to use this plant, then you can. But this is one of the plants that, when I was talking about trying not to replicate foliage earlier on, if you look at the foliage on this plant, it's actually quite similar to the sort of juniper or maybe Hinoki cypress type foliage. So these are the trees that you would avoid putting a plant like this with. This would probably go better with a sort of deciduous tree, a lowland tree. It gives the look of a fern that we might find in sort of forest edges or in sort of shaded copses and stuff like that. So think about trees that you might find in that sort of region to be using plants like this with. This is another Muscari, the same plant as the other one. You can see the blue colour a bit better in this photograph, but if you look at the pot, someone bought this pot for me at No Landers about 10 or 15 years ago, and it's not a very good picture of the pot, but it actually looks like it's a natural piece of stone, and it's actually been made out of ceramics. And the way they fired it, the porcelain or the clay that they've used has actually almost bubbled like lava rock would, and it's got a really rough texture to it. So if we look at the way that I've put this plant in this pot and the actual flow of the pot's got a bit of as we look at the picture now, on the left-hand side, the pot's got a bit of a sort of pointy bit to it, and it's quite sort of abrupt and flat on the right-hand side. So the general direction of this pot of this plant is flowing from the right towards the left. So we would use this with a tree that flows towards the right, and the tree would be placed on the left-hand side of this planting. So the tree and the accent plants actually lean in towards each other, or they flow towards the centre of our display rather than the other way around. This is a terrible picture, unfortunately. This is a little pot that Thorhall Villa made, and unfortunately I didn't realise the picture was that bad, but it's got little skulls and designs, a sort of bamboo type design on the pot. It's a fabulous little pot, and we put this piece of, this is Hakonekloa macra. It's a grass that is a deciduous perennial grass, so it'll die back in winter, all you get is dead stems, but in spring and summer it comes up with this variegated strap-like foliage. It will also successfully put out seed heads, well, flower heads and then seed heads. So it's a versatile grass that can be used in spring when it's just got emergent shoots coming out of the grass or the moss of your pot. It can be used in summer when it's in sort of vibrant foliage like that, or it can be used in autumn when it has seed heads on it. This is another grass called Imperatum cylindricum. It gets this lovely, if you look at the tops of the grass, this was taken earlier on in the spring or early summer. It comes out with green foliage, and as the year progresses and we go towards autumn, then we get more of this red and crimson colour in the grasses. I've used this in quite a colourful pot. You can see the blues and oranges in the pot, and it's a very formal pot and a very formal grass. But it's this plant is more about creating a feeling of maybe coolness or a riverside or a meadowside thing, and also having a splash of colour. So if we're using maybe an evergreen tree, something that's not too sort of rugged or too tortured, quite a more sort of laid back tree, then we could use a grass like this with it. And the idea of this is to add a splash of colour and also seasonal interest. And if you look at the little burrs or the little jetas that some of these plants are put on, you can see how this pot has been put slightly to the right of centre. So this pot would be, this accent plant, actually it gives, because of the way it's been placed on the stand itself, it gives the plant a bit of a flow to the left, because the open space on the stand is on the left hand side, and this is the side that should be facing towards our tree. So a plant like this would be used with a tree that flows to the right, and just, although the accent is very upright and very formal and doesn't look like it's got a direction, and it's a round pot which obviously has got no direction, by just moving it slightly off centre on the stand itself gives us the impression visually that the plant wants to move to the left towards the open space. This is another plant, the same one, Cylindricum imperatum, which is the red grass. These grow about, if you put them in a bigger pot, they'll grow to about sort of maybe 12, 15, 18 inches tall. Once you get them a bit pot bound, get them into accent pots or into small pots, again, they'll grow to about sort of 6, 7, maybe 8 inches tall. So they really will reduce down in size and height. And the longer you leave them in the pots, the more they'll multiply, and you get more of a fulfilled sort of copse image. This is another plant that in winter, once it's gone dormant, you can literally lift it out of the pot. You can cut it with a pair of scissors. You can tear it into little bits. As long as you get a little bit of root with some of the upright stems that are left, the dead stems, then each part will carry on growing again. So you can, every few years, once your pot's full of it, you can just split it and put it into other different pots and keep propagating your own material. Try it in different coloured pots and different shaped pots, and you might find that you've got the accent plant that you want for your display. And again, if we look at this, I've placed this pot slightly to the right of centre, so this will give the plant an impetus of going to the left. The actual pot lip on the right hand side is slightly higher than the pot lip on the left hand side. So these are the little things you need to look for when you're selecting your pot and putting your plant in it, deciding which way you want the direction of your accent plant to flow to. It's worthwhile doing in the first place, just to have a real good look and just see those little subtle differences in height of the pot rims or the pot edges when you're using informal pots or more rustic pots like this one is. This is a sort of blue shaded pot with hints of red in it. Maybe not the ideal pot for the plant because I've got sort of replication in the pot colour a little bit with the red and the red of the plant in the grass leaves itself, but I think the red in the pot is just so sort of subtle and just little tiny specks of it that it gets away with it. You don't see that the pot looks the same colour as the plant. There is actually a contrast there, but they actually complement each other quite well, in my opinion. This is another bit of that Hacken-Necklawer that we talked about earlier on. This has been in this pot for about 3 or 4 years now, and the blades of grass are about 4 inches, maybe 100 mil above the pot. The pot itself is only about 20 mil, maybe 25 mil deep. It's quite a shallow pot, but by using a shallow pot and getting the plant pot bound, these blades of grass and the actual height of the plants has come down really well. If you actually look at the foliage, the higher foliage on the left-hand side of this picture, you can just see seed heads starting to poke through amongst the grass. So this was probably taken, probably taken about August, September time before the seed heads straighten themselves up, and the seed heads will actually stand a little bit higher than the grass once we get through to September and October time. And the grass underneath, the bladed grass that we see as the visual part now, will start dying back, and the seed heads become more dominant or more predominant visually. So this is a good plant to use for either summer foliage colour. It gives the impression of coolness and water, maybe a water's edge, because it looks almost like reeds or marginal grasses. But it also produces these nice seed heads that we can use later on in the year.
Can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
On that previous one there, the accent was is positioned in the bottom right-hand corner of what I presume is a full show-in stand, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. If you've got, and I haven't often seen that, I always imagine the accent to be standing forward to the side of the show-in stand.
It depends. That's another talk again. I mean, but that comes into show-in display. In show-in display, we always try and use an odd number of components, so we can use 3, 5, 7 components in our display. On that particular display, I had 5 components just on the rack itself. So to add the accent plants as part of colour and to show sort of seasonal reference, that's why I did it. Yeah, it was to add that bit of seasonality and a little bit of colour and different texture to the display. I could show you the picture of the whole display one day, or I'll post it on the UKBA Facebook page, and you can decide yourselves whether the accent's suited. But yeah, you're quite right. Sometimes we'll put 5 trees on the display rack, if we've got a 5-tree display rack, and we'll put like a cascade tree on the outside and an accent plant on the outside of the display as well. But then we come into 7 items. But with that one, I just did a 5-item display, or a 5-point display. So the accent plant was used as one of the display points in that. Is why it went on the rack.
Can you have numerous accent plants? So you could put several plants on the stand and some to the side with a cascade or something?
I'm not saying numerous. You might get away with 2. It would be from a sort of purist or a Japanese display point of view, then probably not. They'd probably just have one accent plant. If you did it really well, I would think you'd probably get away with 2, but you're detracting. I mean, generally just 1 accent plant will be enough for you to give the impression of what you want, whether it be seasonality or just adding that speck of colour, or trying to give an impression of where, the habitat of the trees that you're displaying. Because again, in a show-in display, you would want to try and get your trees to complement each other to a degree, and depends on where you place your accent plant as to how it affects the look of your display. So maybe if you're using a 7-point display or a 5-point display, rather than use 2 accent plants, it might be good to use like a suseki, like a viewing stone, as one of your accessory plantings, and use an accent plant as well. So you're not using 2 accent plants, because then you're getting replication again.
Either way, you'd put the suseki, whichever one you put on the main stand, you'd put the other.
Yes, separate from it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we're coming on to, this is an early winter display, which is a couple of little sedge grass planted onto a natural piece of stone. This is a stone collected in Scotland, and if you can't see much of the movement in the stone because I've covered most of it with moss and little bits of grass and a couple of March hares fighting like they do in March. And this is to give the effect of seasonality. So this is definitely a late spring and a late winter or early spring display. So this is the sort of image that we might see out on the sort of fields around Wales, Anglesey area, or up in the Lake District and stuff, or wherever else you might live, where we're lucky enough to have outcrops of rock and these hares that come out and perform these sort of courtship and mating performances in early spring. And this is just to denote, as much to denote the season, but when you look at the colours with the brown of the burr and the sort of slate grey of the rock and the green, the paler green, the brown of the marches, it all sort of goes together and provides a little splash of colour as well, as providing seasonality. This is very, very small as well. I mean, the overall height of this is probably about 5 or 6 centimetres. That's including the little hairs and the rock and everything. So from the base of the burr to the top of the hairs or the top of the grass is probably only about 5 or 6 centimetres. About 2.25 inches, which gives you an idea of the size. It's really quite small and petite, this one. This is one of the little Rhodohypoxus I was talking about before. They're a little South African flowering bulb. Again, this the pot on this is probably about 4 centimetres, and the plant is probably a similar sort of size. So it's really quite small. These are little corms or little bulbs, and they will happily self-propagate in small pots. You put 2 or 3 bulbs in a pot, just leave them there, water them, look after them, keep them dry in winter, and within 2 or 3 seasons you've got 15, 16 bulbs in the pot. So in winter when they're dormant, you can just tip them out, carefully separate them, plant 3 or 4 back into a pot, and then move the other 10 or 12 spares that you've got, plant them into pots 2, 3, 4 at a time, depending how busy you want the pot to be. And you've got complete new accent plants for nothing, and they will just self-propagate themselves. They flower, if you deadhead them, I've found if you leave the flower heads on, they tend to slow down in the flower production. So if you deadhead them regularly, like you might do with your bedding plants or whatever you've got in your hanging baskets, they carry on putting flowers out through to, for the most part, to about August or September. And you can get the first flowers on these in May. So they come in all different colours, which you'll see shortly. And you can match the colour of the flower to different pots. You can put them in formal pots, informal pots, rustic pots, grow them where you like. But they do add a real nice sort of splash and that real impact of colour. So by using a colourful plant like this, we need to keep the plants a little bit smaller because visually they look quite big because of the sort of brightness and the vibrancy of the colour in them. They stand out in a display. So they don't stand out too much, they become a complementary thing rather than the main object. We need to keep the size of these down a little bit when we use them as accent plants in display. Here's another one. I think this was a pot made by Dan Barton. Unfortunately, it's not the best photo. That little stand that they're sitting on is about, I think it's about 80 mil wide. So that gives you an idea of the size of the plant. It's a beautiful little rustic pot, very, very thin walled. The photos unfortunately don't do these justice, but when you look at actually see these pots in real life, I mean, some of these pots they're absolute works of art in themselves, that they look so natural and the colours are really understated in a pot like this. So I've tried to lift it up by using this sort of more brighter pink colour. Again, a good sort of late spring, summer, almost going into early autumn type plant, but it gives that real splash of seasonality, the brightness of summer flowers, and also the vibrancy of the bit of colour, which will lift an otherwise more sort of staid and dull display. And here's another one. I mean, some of these are just showing you the variety and colour of pots. It's another Rhoda hypoxis, slightly different shade. This one flowers a little bit shorter. This only flowers about 3 centimetres high. So it's ideal for use in showing displays. The pot again is another Dan Barton pot. These are just little pots that I picked up along the way. Yeah, you can go on to the next one if you want, Ming. We need to move on. And again, another little Rhoda hypoxis. This pot itself is 2 centimetres tall, and the flower is about 2 centimetres tall. So it gives you an idea. This is, excuse me, really quite minuscule, but we get that strap-like foliage and these beautiful little flowers just appearing above. Unfortunately, I'm not a professional photographer, or some of these pictures would have been a lot better for you. But I think you get the general idea of using these colours and using shapes and textures. And again, this plant has been put slightly off centre on the little Jita that it's standing on. So it would have been used with a tree that was standing on its left-hand side and leaning in towards it, I would think. Okay, so this is a little hosta. Again, it must have had a bit of sunlight on the leaves, but this has like a golden yellow coloured foliage. It's in a little tiny pot. I mean, again, the pot's only about 2.5, 3 centimetres tall. So this gives you an idea of the sort of size of foliage that you can get down to. These are hostas or other plants that they're perennial or deciduous perennial plants, so they'll lose their leaves in winter, but you can take them out of the pot and you'll see that there's little flowering or little growing points on the top of the corm. As long as you leave a growing point on each piece, you can just split them up. I have found that if you let hostas go dry through the winter, which is much better for preserving the roots and the health of the plants, that the roots can actually go quite brittle. So when you come to split them and want to transplant them, you can break the roots. Well, rather than break the roots, if you lift the original plant out of the pot and just stand it in a little tumbler full or a little bowl of sort of lukewarm water, just sort of finger warm for about 20 minutes, then the roots will become sort of fleshy again, almost like spaghetti. And you can bend them round, you can twist them, you can squash them into little pots. You can fill it back up with a little bit of canuma again, and they'll happily grow on for the next year. So these are other plants, hostas, that are particularly good for propagating yourselves, because they will self-propagate within a small pot. And they've got such a fabulous variety of foliage shapes and colours that you can match them with all sorts of different coloured pots and shapes of pots and textures of pots, and come up with anything you like, really. Some will work, some won't, but it's just, well, personally, I just enjoy having the little plants in my collection, whether I use them for exhibition or not. Some of them have been used and some haven't, but they're just nice little things to have around from my point of view. And again, we'll move swiftly through these now because time's moving on, but that's another hosta showing you a slightly darker leaf and in a different pot, a little grey and white pot that looks maybe like a piece of natural rock or a piece of pebble displayed on a little jitter, a very rustic and quite a coarse looking jitter, but it gives the whole, it sort of complements the pot. Yeah, the informality of the pot and the rustic sort of shapes and the ruggedness of it. The jitter complements the ruggedness of the pot, and almost the leaves on that hosta with having like the frilly edges, they've almost got a bit of a ruggedness as well. But the whole lot, to me, seems to go together quite well. It looks okay. With the right tree on display, it'll be fine. This is a little fern, Davalia. This was a dwarf version. Again, that pot, it's a little John Pitt pot. And the pot itself is about 3 centimetres, 3.5 centimetres high. And you can see the way there's the sort of tendrils and the legs of the fern wrap itself around the pot. And the foliage just gives us that nice little bit of simplicity. A little bit of foliage, a little bit of green, but really something quite airy and light to go with a much lighter display in this one. Right, this is a little lobelia. Many of you may have grown these as bedding plants in your hanging baskets, trailing lobelia, or you might have put them in as border plants. This pot is about 4 to 5 centimetres wide, about 3 centimetres high. And this was a little lobelia that I grew from seed. And I basically just put the plant into a little tiny plot and got it root bound. Now, the interesting thing about this is, if you look at the actual flowers, all the flowers on the lobelia are all facing the same direction to give the plant a sort of subtle direction. And this was just achieved by leaving the plant in exactly the same place for about 3 weeks. So the sunlight only came at one side of it, and the side to the right was in shade. The side to the left, as we look at it now, got the sunlight. So the plant itself has actually started inclining towards the left, and all the flowers have orientated themselves towards the left to get into the sunlight better. So that's actually given this plant a direction to the left. I hope you can all see that. That the whole sort of movement and the feeling of the plant is going from right to left, as subtle as it may be, but it's there. So this would be used with a tree that would be planted on the left-hand side of the plant, and the tree would be inclined to the right. So it comes back towards the plant, and the plant goes back towards the tree. This is a little sedum, a good spring flower. It's got foliage on all year round. Graham Walker's the man to talk up to about these. I think he's into this sort of thing. But as you can see, that one's got a little flower on it, which is really nice to use in a sort of May-June display. We have a small show at Wirral Bonsai on the first week of June. So it's nice to have plants like that that are showing a bit of flower, a bit of colour, and something that's a bit different, because you don't normally see these plants in flower in pots. The actual foliage is like a whitey blue colour. I might have made a mistake with the pot, because the pot colours are similar colour. There's a little bit of replication there, and maybe the feeling of the plant is getting lost against the background of the pot. One's merging into the other, but I'm not sure. Maybe they go together. And again, you can see that this plant has a definite direction to the right. So if you even look at the little burr that I placed it on when I took the photo, I've placed the plant on the left-hand side of the burr. So we've got a bit of openness, and the flower and the general flow of the plant is to the right. So everything about this plant is going to the right. So this would be used with a tree that went to the left, and obviously the tree would be planted or would be placed on the right-hand side of this plant. So the two come towards the center of the display like we talked about earlier. This is a little plant called Petrinia triloba. I've included it because it's got fabulous color throughout the year. It's a deciduous perennial. It loses its leaves in winter where it doesn't have any colour. But it has these lovely little flower heads appear above it, and these will go into seed heads in autumn. The foliage colour will go from this sort of lime green through to a darker green, and then it goes into reds and oranges and golds into sort of autumn time. It's very, if you look at the foliage sort of shape, it's quite similar to sort of trident maple, or maybe a field maple or a maple type foliage. So you'd want to avoid using a plant like this with a sort of maple. What I was saying earlier on about this repetition of foliage texture and foliage shape. So if you actually look at it, the actual leaves look a little bit like a sort of sycamore type, field maple type, trident maple type leaf. So I try not to use it, or I'd avoid using a plant like this with a maple, but it'd be fine with sort of oval shaped deciduous trees, and even with conifers and stuff like that, if you want to add that bit of colour and a bit of seasonality. Again, this is the same plant, but this is like 2 years later on from when that other picture was taken. You can see it's starting to get a lot more flower heads on it now, and the flower heads are quite sort of nice and yellow against this sort of green foliage. So that's a nice vibrant sort of late spring, early summer plant that we can use for a display. That's a little picture of, again, a very poor picture, but that's some of my Rhodohypoxis. They're just on a pallet down at my allotment. They're all in 3-inch pots. And every couple of years, I just grow them in pots. I water them. I give them a little bit of miracid twice a year, or a bit of seaweed feed or something, not a great deal. And then every couple of years, I just flip them. I'll take them out of the pots, and I'll split them down from maybe 20, 30 little bulbs in a pot down to about 4 or 5 in each pot, and then just grow them on again. And then This is again, this is the Petrinia triloba. Now you can just start seeing the flowers are going over. They're going from yellow to a little bit of white, and you can see a little tiny bit of colour just starting to come into the foliage, especially on the right-hand side and the left-hand side. It's just starting to get a little bit of darkness about the foliage. So this will be moving on into sort of June, July, maybe August time now with this type of plant. Right, this is the same plant or the same variety of plants, and this is moving more into autumn time now, so you can start to see the reds and the yellows and the golds. Again, it's not a very good picture, and there's quite a lot of quite vibrant blue in that pot. The pot looks a lot bluer in real life than what you can see on the picture, but it really highlights the oranges and the yellows in the plant itself. So that's a good autumn plant. And this was the same plant earlier on in the year before the proper colours had taken over. This was just going from about July into August maybe. The flowers are just sort of finishing now, and the foliage is starting to change colour. So it happily moves from season to season and can be very useful season to season. And just on a side note, Graham Walker asked me for a propagation of this about 2 years ago, and I did take him a propagation, and it is sitting on my bench. And the next time I see him at a show, I will pass it on to him. This is a little plant called a Runcus aesthetifolius. It's got a very little fern-like leaf on it. It's a very delicate plant. It gets tremendous autumn colour, and it also has little flowers on it at the right time of year. But the flowers are quite insignificant, but it does leave a little seed head in autumn, and it's got such fantastic autumn colour on it of reds and golds and yellows. It's another great plant to have around. You can show it in spring when it has this really vibrant lime green foliage on it as it emerges, and then it gradually colours and darkens off through the year. So it's a plant for all seasons apart from winter, really, where it's a deciduous perennial, so it has no leaves on it in winter. But spring, summer, and autumn, then it's a good plant to have on standby because it'll go with many displays throughout any of those 3 seasons. Right, this is a little thing that John Pitt made, and it's actually an image of a half-sunken boat. So it's made out of pottery porcelain, and it's frost-proofed, so you can see the image of the boat. What I've done is I've planted it on a piece of slate that I cut with a bit of a rough sort of informal edge to try and give the impression of a bit of a pond edge. So this looks like an old boat that's maybe sunken years ago, and it's starting to rot away. And I've used a bit of sedge grass here to emulate rushes and reeds sort of growing over the boat. So the boat looks like it's been there for a good few years, and it's just stuck at the side of a lake or the side of a pond or a couple of yards away from it. And I've used a little crane, a little bronze crane, just sort of flying out of the boat, which you can see in the middle. Now, this is another one. You can see the whole direction of this plant is to the left. Yeah, even the way the crane's flying, the way the bow of the boat is, the way the spacing of the plant's been made, and the way it's been put on the mast, everything gives the whole impression of this accent plant moving to the left. So obviously the trees on the left-hand side moving to the right. It's not my accents. This is one that was put together by one of our club members, but it's a similar sort of theme. I think this pot was off Daniel Butler of Wood and Clay, and he uses little bits of glass or like enamel glazing in the middle of the pot, so it tends to look like water. So if you can see in the front sort of left-hand third of the pot, there's that like little bit of green or bluish shining through, which almost looks like that's the one ring. Yeah, it looks like it's a little bit of water, and we've got the plants, the sedge plants and the grasses look like they're reeds. And again, the cranes look like they give the impression of a river edge or a pond edge where the birds have come down for a bit of coolness and maybe get something to drink and find a bit of shelter for the night. So it all this sort of plant gives the impression of habitat, of like a river's edge or a pond edge, or a tree that grows near water would be very good to display with an accent like this. And this is the final one. This is a little potentilla of mine. And this is more to show you about the effect of the display. The tree obviously goes from left to right in a display by the way the tree's styled and set out. And even if you look at the tree has been placed very much to the left of the slab that it's on. So we've got this clear space underneath and to the right of the lower branch of the tree. And it all helps enhance the movement of the tree to the right when we're doing display. And then we look at the accent plant that I put with it. That's the little boat you saw previously. So the crane and the plant and the boat are all moving towards the tree, or they visually look like they're moving towards the tree. If you look at the height of the accents, this is very difficult because I put this tree on a burr rather than a table. Then I'm losing a lot of height. And what I said earlier on about the accent shouldn't come above the top of the table and certainly shouldn't come above the top of the pot. Then I've probably just about got it here, that the accent is just about level with the top of the pot. But by spacing it slightly further away from the tree, it doesn't look quite so obvious. So these are all little tips to do with display and stuff, which I'm sure maybe in another few months or next year or something, we can maybe have a chat about that as well. And we can talk about, or we can show some pictures of trees with accent plants and decide what's good and what's right, and what works and what doesn't, because that's pretty much the way to do it, I think.
Andy, you've also set it a little bit further back, so it gives it a bit more of a feeling of height, I think.
Yeah,
that's how it looks.
Yeah, it gives depth and perspective as well. Yeah, absolutely. That all goes into the aspects of display and positioning within your display area. But that's a whole different boring talk again. Any questions? And ladies, of course. Any questions?
Andy, that was just full of just information, mate. You know, to digest all of that is so difficult.
Too much.
But it is. But your idea of the non-replication of the colours, the pot shapes, the pots, the stands, the whole thing like that is you know, it's simple, but then when you get into depth in the different things, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. You know, the different things involved. But one, as you say, once you start looking into it a little bit more, and you're trying to get that display where you've got no, well, you want asymmetry, you want no replication in foliage, texture, colour, pot textures, pot colours, pot shapes, and even with 3 items, it becomes a very difficult thing to do. I don't know if anyone noticed on that the last picture I put up, we showed talking about display. I showed that potentilla with a little boat to give a feeling of a tree that was grown over a water's edge or maybe by a riverbank, which I felt that tree looked like to me. But I used a scroll that had, it was made by Daryl Coggabin. I don't know if she's on here tonight, or painted by her. It was a sort of late summer, early autumn scroll, and it was a little fly fisherman in a boat fishing on a lake. And it was pointed out to me that I'd replicated the feeling of water within my boat accent and the boat I had on the scroll. And all I could do was put my hands up and say, absolutely, that's what I've done. And really, I shouldn't have done it. I should have tried to think of something a bit more imaginative for my scroll. You know, something a bit different that didn't. It needs to be quite subtle, really. We don't want sticks of Blackpool rock on our scrolls to say the tree came from Blackpool. It wants to be something a little bit more subtle than that, if you understand what I mean. So just those slices of hints to habitat or to season and stuff are often enough. Although I feel that maybe the Japanese, and as I alluded to earlier on, maybe the Japanese are a little bit more sort of, their culture's a little bit more defined and a bit more refined than ours in those sort of things. So they notice things like that, whereas we might not. We might need to be maybe just that a little bit more obvious in our display techniques to get things across the general. I'm getting myself into trouble here, aren't I? I'm slagging down the general British view in public, but yeah, I don't know.
But it's
finding that balance, yeah, and that understanding for people.
When we in Britain try to follow the Japanese line, and you do a display that might have I don't know, 10 dimensions to it, that could you possibly got to make all 10 of them not repeat. It's almost an impossibility for most of us. You know, someone points one duplication out to you on yours, but many of us would have many. But it's all about trying to get there. Sometimes I feel that you've got to have about 100 accent pots, 100 this, 100 stands, in order that you can achieve one display that hits the button.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. But I don't think that should stop you from putting off from displaying. So long as you understand what your faults are and you can negate them as much as possible. I think that, I mean, certainly from my own point of view, I haven't got that quantity of showing trees and stands to get the perfect display. So I tend to try and put together the best I possibly can from what I've got available, and then look to improve it next year or the year after. I'm constantly striving to improve it. So if I need to change a pot on a tree, or I actually need to change a tree or get a different tree in, then rather than go out, you know, thinking, oh, I'm going to buy 10 trees this year, I will specifically go and look for that one tree that will complement that display. And the more you build it up and put it together, and the more you come with different numbers of trees, certainly in showing display, the more sort of sacred and valuable it becomes to yourself. You get that real feeling of achieving a little bit more and getting that bit, progressing a bit more, and getting things right. And you can see it in your displays yourself. And that, to me, whether other people see my displays or not, it gives me satisfaction that they're starting to look more like I envisioned them looking, and how I feel they should look. They complement each other, colour-wise, texture-wise. All of the trees and the pots are in proportion to each other. You know, we haven't even gone into proportionality that much, but yeah, it's a big thing or there's a lot of different things to take into consideration. But you don't have to be an expert at the whole lot to put a reasonable display together. As long as you're starting to get the principles right of not replicating your pot shapes, your pot colours. You might not get the perfect plants, but at least you're on the lines to understanding it and making sure that if you put a tree, or if you want to submit a tree for expo, or if you're even doing a club show and you want to put an accent plant with it and create more of a formal traditional display, then you've got a little bit of understanding of what you're doing and what you should be looking for to do that. I mean, we encourage from the Wirral, we've been keen on display for, well, yes, since I sort of took over as chairman. Ian sort of instigated it a bit, but I'm particularly into showing trees, and I enjoy the aspect of display and all that sort of thing. So I probably promoted that a little bit myself anyway. But yeah, it's a nice way to sort of look at getting not an end point for your trees, but getting your trees to a point where you say, yeah, I'm comfortable of putting them forward for a bigger show now, or even putting them forward for our own club show and making my display stand out a little bit more than the rest, you know, for going that extra bit of effort. And accent plants, well, as most of you, well, anyone that knows me, or most of you might be getting together, I just love growing things. So they're just another thing that I can grow in my garden and enjoy them all year round. You know, whether I put them with a display or not, they're nice to look after and nice to keep on top of, and nice to watch them change through the seasons as well. Yeah, that's it. Any more questions?
Anybody? Well, it doesn't look so, Andy. Andy, on behalf of all of us, thank you. That was very, very good talk tonight.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.